Hello, Mike Butcher here, editor-at-large of TechCrunch, and this is the Midweek show, which happens every midweek, every Wednesday at 3 p.m. London time, 4 p.m. Paris time, and you can work out the math from there. Well, what is it? It's a show where I give you some hot takes on the news, and then I interview someone related to the news in some way. If you'd like to pitch to appear on the show, or if you have any other feedback, you can just email me on mike@mikebutcher.me, and all these shows are archived on mikebutcher.me/midweek. So, getting into the news. So far this week, Apple has won its EU court fight over a record $14.9 billion Irish tax bill, as the EU General Court ruled that Ireland's tax arrangements with the company were not legal. Oh, sorry. What am I misread that. Weren't illegal. In other words, they were illegal. Live TV, huh? Ireland's challenging the European Commission decision. Now, this means that effectively has huge ramifications for tech firms across Europe. It means that Ireland's getting a win out of it, and because Apple won, and Ireland, as we know, has often been relatively speaking, a tax haven for big, large tech companies over the last few years. So all the big tech companies who have formerly HQ in Dublin or in Ireland, they're going to be looking at this very closely. Yahoo News is reporting that the CIA has conducted cyber attacks against Iran, Russia, and others since Trump signed a secret order in 2018, giving the CIA more freedom for such activity. So in other words, it looks effectively like Trump has been playing both sides. He's been conducting cyber attacks against Russia, and yet Russia is also conducting cyber attacks to help get him into power. This is really the definition of playing both sides of the table, don't you think? Facebook and Sony are said to be ramping up production of Oculus VR and PlayStation 5 devices by as much as 50% as demand is soaring during the pandemic. Many of you might have friends or colleagues who've been buying up Oculus Quests and PlayStation VR devices in order to use these things at home as we live in this sort of lockdown life. Even with unlocking, I think it's clearly changed behavior to the extent where VR might well have had its mainstream moment, and we'll see how that plays out over the next few months and years. Now, we're all Zooming, aren't we? We're always on Zoom calls, and Zoom has unveiled now a $599 all-in-one home communications device with a 27-inch screen, preloaded Zoom software, 8 microphones, and 3 wide-angle cameras. Zoom has become effectively the de facto standard for online communications during the pandemic because people like to see faces, don't they? So Zoom is really trying to effectively monetize its very dominant position now by bringing out this hardware device. This kind of device is very much a commodity device. It can be put together relatively quickly in hardware terms. And if it's hardwired with Zoom, then it means that it could well become a de facto device, not just for business communications, but for chatting to friends, neighbors, and relatives and family. So who knows what's going to happen there? It's really interesting to see how people have used video over this crazy period over the last few months. Following the controversy over Huawei being removed from UK networks by 2027, now Samsung is predicting early commercialization of 6G networks as early as 2028. So wait a second. So we're going to go to 5G by 2027, and then we're going to be already in 6G. I mean, I don't know. It gets confusing, isn't it? But what this means is that Samsung is placing its bet on something called a terahertz radio spectrum to reach peak data rates, which are 50 times 5G. So 5G is supposed to be close to home broadband levels of broadband. 50 times faster than 5G, you're in nirvana. Now, let's move on to our interview this week. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that the pandemic has had enormous effects on how we live and work. And in the startup world, in tech entrepreneurship, there's been a thing called OKRs, objectives and key results, which has helped people scale up their companies. But we're in the middle of a crisis. So I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic and instructive to bring on somebody to chat today who is familiar with working in a crisis. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ben Ford, who's the CEO and founder of Commando Dev. Now, Ben, you are a former Royal Marine, are you not?
That's right, Mike. Yep. I actually taught myself to code while I was on the way to Iraq in 2003. And I've been working in the tech industry as both a programmer and a tech lead, CTO ever since. It was a long time. I thought that the things I learned in the Marines weren't actually very relevant, but when it comes to leadership and setting direction for a company, they soon come back into relevance very quickly.
Well, exactly, and that's why I thought it would be so fascinating to hear from you today, because I'm sure that kinds of feedback you got from contacts when the pandemic hit were people running around like headless chickens, and it's the sort of thing that I'm going to assume that in the military, of course, you're taught to deal with those very fast-moving situations. Let's start from first principles, shall we? In the business world, we're familiar with this OKR concept, objectives and key results, and it's been very much applied in the startup world. What's your definition of that, and how do you think it might not be fit for purpose during a crisis where we are right now?
Okay, well, I mean, it's like many things, isn't it? Anything that we use to sort of package up how we operate on a day-to-day basis has the danger of becoming sort of dogmatic, and doctrine becomes dogma very easily. And OKRs, I feel, is a little bit like that. So one of the things that Andy Grove said was first let chaos reign and then reign in chaos. Now,
famously the founder of Intel.
Correct, yeah. So I've worked in lots and lots of tech startups where chaos is the norm, and I've been on operations with the Royal Marines where well, I mean, that's the whole point with us being there, right? Is because things are in chaos, and there's supposed to be some attempt to mitigate the chaos. But the problem is whenever, and this is the same with agile and, pick your poison, basically, is as soon as it becomes packaged up such that people can start selling it, you lose a bit of the essence. So my main issue with OKRs as currently experienced is that they are far too linear, right? They are this kind of, you assume that you have a key result, an objective, sorry, and you assume that you can just linearly deconstruct key results all the way down the organization. Those will all get sort of bitten off and completed, and then yay, everyone's happy at the end of the quarter.
So it's become too much of a sort of a tick boxing exercise.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's lost the essence of the original point, right? The original point when you read Measure What Matters, or in fact, it might have been a different book actually by Andy Grove, is that OKRs was used to completely pivot the direction of Intel when another chip manufacturer came out with a competitor. And that's the whole point. It's not this kind of linear, tick off things like some sort of linear roadmap. It's really designed to reorientate yourself. And, we can talk about orientation maybe as a separate concept that's actually probably much more important.
So what are some of the, so yeah, look, let's go for that. So in the military strategy world, along came a guy called John Boyd, Colonel John Boyd, who was a military pilot in the US Air Force, and he came up with a whole bunch of concepts around fighting battles and getting in front of the opposing aircraft, but seemed to apply it to military strategy. So can you tell us a little bit about what that is and why it might be relevant today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm gonna sort of preface this with a small comment first. So I didn't actually hear about Boyd's ideas at all while I was in the military, and I think that's actually quite common, unless you've been to sort of staff college, at sort of major lieutenant colonel level. You don't hear about Boyd. Like, Boyd was an Air Force officer. He only got to colonel because he said things that upset lots of people. and he found his spiritual home actually in the U.S. Marine. So he, for an air, if anyone knows anything about the military, for somebody to find their spiritual home who's an Air Force guy in the Marines, he has to be onto something big style. So Boyd's main idea was the OODA loop, and he was a pilot. Before he came up with the OODA loop, he came up with something called energy maneuver theory, which is still used. I think if you fly fast jets, you probably would know about that.
So this was all about getting in, trying to fire your guns at the opposing aircraft, but turning in a very, very different manner. But this OODA loop you're talking about, can you explain that to us?
Yeah, sure. So OODA stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, and it was really the culmination of Boyd's, incredible drive to cover. I mean, basically, if you want a précis of all of military doctrine ever, read about Boyd's work. His Patterns of Conflict is an amazing piece of work. But the OODA loop is unfortunately also sort of a victim to this idea, the same thing that happens to OKRs, right? People want to make it linear, make it more explainable. And the OODA loop really is about how organisms of any type, which includes organizations, adapt to their environment. So observation is when you see something happening. Oh, there's a pandemic just hit, or we're going to miss our deadlines, or we've got a competitor that's come onto the market. That's a sort of strategic situational awareness, if you like. Orientation is the bit where you take what you've seen, or what you've observed, and you figure out what it means. So observation is kind of the objective, what's happening in the world. Orientation is the subjective, what does this mean to us? And then you decide on a course of action, and you take an action. But even decision and action, they're not part of a linear process. Right. Observations and orientations can build up over time, and then suddenly a decision to act is triggered, and each of these things feeds back into the other. So the way that Boyd described it as a loop, or the way many people describe it as a loop, I don't think Boyd actually ever did. But even Boyd's diagram, which is much more detailed, tends to be simplified to the point of losing the essence of it as we experience it. And
so that obviously took off in amongst military strategists, and it was relatively obscure until more recent times, when we've got people like Dominic Cummings now at Number 10 Downing Street, who's a big fan of Colonel John Boyd and the OODA loop and similar kinds of military tactics applied to the political sphere. But how can tech companies and startups take some of that and then apply it in their world? Because that's very sort of an adversarial, and sometimes if you let yourself be defined by your competition, maybe you don't produce the right kind of product. So are there other kinds of ways of like taking that theory or softening it, or applying it in a more sort of practical manner to business strategy?
Yeah, sure. So that, I mean, this is one of the problems with Boyd's work, right? So it is presented as an adversarial, you versus them kind of framework. It doesn't mean that you can't apply it. I mean, I think that, having read into, Boyd covered thermodynamics, he covered incompleteness theory, he covered a hell of a lot of ground, including Sun Tzu, as he was coming up with these ideas. So actually what you do have is a very applicable general way of kind of reasoning about how things interact with each other. But another, more specifically to your question, another piece of military sort of doctrine, and again, doctrine is a bit of a problematic word, but is the concept of mission command. So mission command is something that came out of the Blitzkrieg. It's the way the Germans were able to essentially apply OODA loops to completely overwhelming all of their opposition in Europe in the 1940s.
And did that? 30s. Was mission command a concept that was taken up by the other militaries, the US or UK?
So yeah, mission command. So the Blitzkrieg is essentially mission command. So more recently, there's a scholar, ex-army officer now, US Marine, who works in the US Marine University, called Don Vandergriff, who's written a book called Adopting Mission Command. And he calls mission command the doctrine of empowerment, right? So it's how you set a direction, it's how you set a desired outcome, but it's also how you get out of the way and let your people achieve it. And often in tech companies, I see founders, especially tech leaders, especially, being a bit too sort of hands-on. It's very difficult because the subtext of mission command is that you have to let go of control, and some people find that difficult because when you let go of control, you feel like you have lost the ability to direct things. So it's a bit troubling for some people to do that.
How could you sum up what mission command is? Are there sort of 2 or 3 principles?
Yeah, so I mean, a good summary, although it doesn't really mention mission command, is a book called Team of Teams by General Stan McChrystal. So essentially, what you do is you set the goal that you want, you set the boundaries within which your people have to operate. So you could be in a heavily regulated environment. You can't just let people go and do what they want. You might be in a situation where you have a certain set of technology choices because they work for you. You don't want everyone just going off and sort of playing their own game. And then you set those boundaries, but then within those boundaries, people are free to execute on their own tempo and decide for themselves what's the right course of action to take. Which means that from an OODA perspective, the people at the teeth of an organization are much more empowered and much more able to operate and turn things over quicker and quicker.
I see. So now I was switched on to a really fantastic piece of work that you've written yourself, taking some of these concepts and distilling them down. And they did seem to me to the sort of things that could be applied very much to tech companies. So do you think, therefore, let's go back to our original conversation about OKRs, and now we're back. We're now into this world of mission command and empowerment. Are there ways? Would you blend OKRs and mission command? Would you flip straight to this new environment? And also in the concept, and let's cover that first. Then I want to talk about what we do after the pandemic. Carry on.
Sure. Okay. So let's sort of unpick that a little bit. So OKRs is a pre-baked system, right? It's you work in quarters, you deliver in 2 weeks, so sprints, and Agile is a system. And the problem with all of those things is that they're a great starting point, but they are not sufficient you can't just take somebody else's system and implement it, right? Some companies can do okay with somebody else's system if they're very similar. The problem is that as we're now into the world of kind of exponential change, and another term from the military has become very popular recently, which is VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So the more that happens, the more we are into exponential change and being unable to predict what's going to happen, the more we have to create our own systems. So for me, it's more important to read things like OKRs, read about mission command, understand the OODA loop, and then understand that what you're doing is basically you're seeding an evolution of systems that arise within your own company and organization, such that they are fit for purpose in your context. So, taking somebody else's playbook, it might be better than the playbook you're using, especially if you're not using one at all, which is quite common. But eventually you're going to run out of, benefit from that. Does that answer your question?
I think we could talk for hours about this, but what I want to get from you, two more things I want to get from you is, firstly, do you think that people could apply concepts of mission command and these other kinds of military strategies to their situation? And do you think they might, if they did so, would that last beyond the crisis of the pandemic, or do you think it's just something you apply in a crisis situation?
Got it. Right. Okay. Yes, absolutely. You can apply specifics, and absolutely they very much should last beyond the crisis, because no company is a sunlit kind of paddle down a gentle stream, right? You're always going to hit things that happen where you need to react. So there are a couple of things that I would say you could do. So so I've adapted the military orders process, which is a very specific, military context process you go through when you're going to tell people what you want them to go out and achieve. And the only bits you really need to kind of think about when you're setting out what objectives you want people to have is situation, mission, and execution. Right? In the military context, there's loads of other stuff like ground, enemy forces, and all that kind of other stuff. But it's why, it's what, and it's how. Right? So and you start with why, like Simon Sinek very wisely said. Why are we doing this? Right? Why does it matter? Because then that gives people the orientation on what's important, because if things go wrong, they're going to have to, test and adjust. Mm-hmm. It's what specifically are we going to do? That's your objective, right? So that's your, the bit that sets up the thing that we're trying to achieve. And then it's okay, let's plan this out, because, most tech companies, Agile has been grossly misused. And you end up with this kind of idea that, we don't need planning, I can't remember who said it offhand, but it's, planning is essential. Plans are useless. No plan survives first contact with the enemy. But actually thinking through and structuring things and deciding how you're going to bite off a piece of work is essential, because it gets everyone on the same page. So that's a, almost direct translation of something that works in the military that I believe would work very well for tech companies and startups.
And I know you've written extensively about this in a fantastic piece we want to hear more about in a second. But finally, I'd like to hear from you. What should leaders do at this time? What kinds of advice can you give to CEOs and founders of companies when they're in leadership positions and they've got to take their team through this period now?
So the biggest piece of advice I could say is just think about how you implement transparency in your organization. All right, many leaders implement transparency downwards. They want to see what everyone's up to, right? They think that that's transparency. But all that means is that as your organization grows, you're getting the same amount of information. You're overwhelming yourself. You've got too much to deal with, too much on your plate. So what I would say for leaders is think about changing the direction of transparency to being the transparency of why we're doing what we're doing, so that everyone below you can see the direction, but you don't have to be bothered with day-to-day details of exactly what's happening. That can all be sort of, given to you in aggregate by basically instilling mutual trust, so that, you empower your people to go and do what needs to be done, and you only get the bits that really matter. And then that kind of gives you the freedom to focus on the outside world a bit more.
I see. Right. Well, Ben, so how can people learn more about some of your ideas on this subject? You Commando Dev, is it Commando Dev online? What's the URL?
Yeah, so it's commando.dev for the website. I am at Commando Dev, all one word, on Twitter and LinkedIn. I've written a few articles on LinkedIn, sort of digging into this from a sort of, slightly more technical, deeper point of view. And I'm actually doing a course on this. So specifically for, companies that have reached that 20 to 30 person inflection.
You're offering a course.
Yes, I'm in the middle of, defining what that is going to be. So if you're interested in anything that I've sort of chatted about, ping me on Twitter. Definitely is the first step. And you'll get the chance to put your 2 pence into the hat of what you'd like me to cover specifically, because when you go from general to specific, it would be great to have some people who are actually struggling with this, who can sort of tell me exactly what their problems are.
Well, that's fantastic. That'd be great. I'd be fascinating to hear how that goes, especially with you actually forming the course around what people really need right now. So I really look forward to you being able to ping that out, and we'll certainly push that out when that comes out. But for now, Ben Ford from Commando Dev, former Royal Marine, really thank you so much for coming and talking to Midweek with Mike. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. That was Ben Ford there of Commando Dev, and some of the concepts he talked about: situational awareness, coming from the military and being able to be applied to the world of startups. Well, you can see all of these interviews on mikebutcher.me/midweek. There's some great content up there. We've been doing this all through the last few weeks of the lockdown and the pandemic to get under the skin of what's been going on, and hopefully we'll be doing a lot more in many weeks to come. If you want to get notified about midweek shows, just tune in on Mike Butcher on Twitter. I'm usually at Mike Butcher on just about everything. And you can also sign up to my newsletter, tinyletter.com/Mike Butcher, tinyletter.com/Mike Butcher. And now I'll be back next week. So see you midweek. But from me, Mike Butcher, for now, goodbye and have a great rest of the week.
Call from 0330.